Hi, my name's Deb Raji, and I am a Mozilla Fellow studying algorithmic auditing and evaluation. I work very closely with the Algorithmic Justice League Initiative, which was founded by Joy Bulamwini at the MIT Media Lab. And I've worked with Google's ethical AI team, thinking about research engineering practice for responsible machine learning development, as well as the Partnership on AI and the AI Now Institute at New York University. I'm glad to be here.
And hi, my name is Camille Francois. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at Graphica, an affiliate at the Harvard Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, and the Mozilla Fellow. In this capacity, I have the pleasure and honor to work with Deb on a project at the Algorithmic Justice League, where we are trying to figure out what is the best way to report and address algorithmic harms. And Deb, I'm very excited for people to hear more about the work that you've been doing in this area. And so if I'm allowed to ask the first question, I will ask a leading one that says, Deb, tell us about your work looking into what are the current ways in which algorithmic harms are discovered, are investigated, and then ultimately are addressed. What are the types of processes that exist to do that? And the real question I want to ask is it really like just people complaining on Twitter, and then this makes the headlines, and then corporations finally take it seriously? I know you've worked a lot on surveying the existing practices, and I think that's a great place to start.
Yeah, so for one thing, the Twitter outrage leading to press attention and public outrage is definitely a strategy, and we describe this strategy as sort of like a participatory approach towards identifying harms, where you have like the public being able to, or member of the public being able to identify that they've been negatively affected by an algorithm. They post about it, and it garners attention, and that causes people to pay attention to the harm and attempt to address it. A common example of this would be with the Apple Card credit assignment situation, where Apple was releasing credit cards, and different levels of credit were given to men and women, and a very prominent technologist had posted about it and escalated the issue. And that's sort of more of a participatory approach, and we do see that a lot. That is a lot of cases of algorithmic harm, or just people getting upset and escalating it over social media. But there's a lot of other really interesting strategies that people have as well in terms of reporting these harms. An interesting strategy that's been championed at Northeastern's sort of data journalism program and lab has been this approach of transparency for the sake of discovery. So they will sort of, through FOIA requests, attempt to list out and articulate all the different types of algorithms being used by a very critical agency, let's say ICE or the Department of Homeland Security. And then just by virtue of having a complete or visible list of the kind of algorithms being used, having that disclosure, you'll be able to sort of get a sense of which algorithms are impactful and be able to investigate further which algorithms to pay attention to. This is also an approach that was sort of the logic behind the Post Act in New York, to sort of enforce a little bit of visibility and disclosure around what kind of surveillance tools NYPD was using, and that helps people be able to sort of take a look at that list and identify, which are likely to cause harm. So the strategy of disclosure is also a really sort of popular technique. And then there's this sort of third strategy of like internal inspection or internal auditing. And this is where the tech companies will either have some level of like customer feedback, or like built into their product or built into their process, or they'll have like an internal audit team whose job it is to really actively think about what can go wrong, and try to explore all these different strategies and attempt to discover harms through that sort of speculative process. So yeah, lots of interesting strategies from different individuals in the harms discovery stage, which is very much, less of a focus. I think the machine learning community is really into this sort of like reactive phase where people are just realizing that things can go wrong in this way, and they're jumping right away to like, how can we actually, analyze these harms? How can we fix them? So it's been really fun to actually explore how we discover these harms and how we find out that things are wrong in the first place.
For sure. And I think that for our project, this was a point of departure, right? Like, as you said, the fact that there's a little bit of that just happening on social media in a crowdsourced way, perhaps is okay. Perhaps it's
Yeah.
some form of like participatory harms discovery. And as we were thinking through, like, what other models could we learn from in order to create these maybe more viable, maybe more structured participatory harms discovery, we ended up thinking about the bug bounties in
Yeah.
CSAC and sort of studying that bug bounty model to learn really what could be brought from these practices into the algorithmic harm space, and to also learn what are the things that can go wrong when you're setting up these bug bounty platforms.
Yeah, yeah. I think that was like a very important like step in terms of insight where the way that participatory harms discovery happens right now for algorithmic harm is so haphazard. Everyone has their own understanding of how they're aggrieved. Something that's been really great about like exploring bug bounty literature is that they're super thoughtful around ideas around like verification. Like if just because someone feels like they've been harmed, how do you actually verify that the security vulnerability is there, or in this case, the algorithmic harm is legitimate? How do you actually prioritize different harms that have been reported? And I think that like these are all things that are very kind of they've been reflected on in the security space, and in the algorithmic harm space we haven't really thought about that yet. And this was something that I think, Camille, you had mentioned as well, in terms of what is that connection between security vulnerabilities and algorithmic harms, and what do you see as the thing that links those two, in terms of how we approach both of them, but also just theoretically, how do you see them being linked or connected?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think that we've spent a bit of time thinking about what is similar between algorithmic harms and sort of cybersecurity vulnerability and what is different. And I think more importantly, we spent quite a bit of time thinking about like what is similar with the state of the field
Mm-hmm.
of cybersecurity when bug bounties became a thing, and what is similar between the state of the field and algorithmic harm at that moment where we question what does a participatory and responsible harms discovery process look like.
Yeah.
I want to share the sort of like main questions that we've had when we started looking into bug bounty literature and talking to people in the bug bounty space, because I think they sort of help get a precise idea of where we're after. The first one is really understanding how bug bounties help structure communities of practice. And we looked at bug bounties programs and platforms to think about like our own community of practice around people who can do the discovery of algorithmic harms, and thinking, do bug bounties and open competitions play a role in creating this community of practice? It was really interesting in talking to like bug bounty platforms to hear that they really see their own role as talent platforms, right? Like
Yeah.
going to see and like recruiting new hackers and telling
Yeah.
them come and tinker and play with this. And I think like that we kind of want to bring from this space into.
Yeah. Do you feel like there's a cohesive community in the algorithmic auditing space, or do you feel like that's still sort of this very disparate thing and there's different communities out there right now?
um I don't know. What do you think? I think that there's quite a bit that we can do to help create like
A
a
more cohesive. Yeah, I don't want to interrupt you either. I was just, yeah, I think like in the algorithmic auditing space, it's really interesting because you have very different groups doing this work in terms of just practical algorithmic auditing work. You have like journalists, like at the Markup, for example, doing an algorithmic audit, but you also have civil society orgs, or advocacy orgs like the ACLU and AJL, but also like regulatory bodies like NIST. And then, like I mentioned, these internal auditing teams. So it's a really interesting ecosystem of like people that would see themselves as being part of a community doing this work. And I've always found that an interesting difference between sort of security, where it seems like there's a little bit more cohesion around this identity of being a hacker, that we still like haven't quite pinned down in the algorithmic auditing space.
That being said, like the hacker literature really tells you that there are different communities of hacker, and that by and large, the idea of the hacker community with sort of
Yeah.
like one big C is a bit of a misnomer, really. But
Yeah.
I think that leads us well to like our second question when we looked at these bug bounties, which is what do they contribute in terms of tools and methods to empower this community of practice and really to help people consider it as a viable path, right? Like, what type of templates do they put on the table?
Yeah.
What type of tools and tutorials? Like, what do we need
Yeah.
for the bar to be lowered for
Yeah.
people to join this community practice, right? For people to say like, well, I might do like casual hunting for 6 hours and I will learn something and perhaps be able to do a contribution.
Yeah.
And I think like we learned quite a bit in terms of like how much there is still to structure to help empower the community in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And the third sort of question that we had that I think was perhaps the most difficult for us to wrestle with is what do bug bounties contribute in terms of increasing transparency and accountability around these issues at the industry level? And like, let me know if you agree, but I think like this is where we've seen most of the sort of counter examples, right? Like talking to hackers and platforms who are saying like, yes, there's this great sort of like magic bug bounty ideas, right? You have a problem, just put a bug bounty on it and the problem will become transparent and the entities will be held accountable. But in reality, because of the dynamics around the NDA and some of the dynamics around the disclosure, it isn't evident at all that this process creates large-scale transparency and accountability, which I think gave us a little bit to think about. And the sort of entire purpose of this exercise for us is really to understand what are the design considerations, what are the different levers we can play, things we can learn so that we can shape participatory harms discovery space that makes sense.
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, like your last point, definitely in my mind, I'm thinking of like the anti-examples in the algorithmic auditing space that we've talked about in terms of just, with algorithmic auditing, especially as an external auditor, as someone that's not an employee or not even a hired consultant by the company, that relationship can turn adversarial in a very important way. I thought something interesting too about the work you guys have done on bug bounties is that, the at the beginning of the security, like if you look historically, there was mention of this idea that security wasn't always embraced by industry. Their companies were not always as cooperative in the setup of bounties, in the infrastructure, and in the support of like security professionals. So it's possible that maybe we're just in that early phase with algorithmic auditing, but I do know that one of the distinctive factors of algorithmic systems, and in particular machine learning systems, is that data requirement. The fact that you need to look at the data and access certain details about that, and that the information around the data or access to the model in order to be able to audit it. And that's something that I think in security, sometimes with just like a consumer level of access to the product or the software, you can be able to discover a lot of different vulnerabilities. Whereas with algorithmic auditing, it's this challenge of you actually having to have a certain amount of in-depth access to the model before you can actually be able to assess it or understand some of these issues, such as bias, for example. So yeah, it's this weird thing where you kind of need the cooperation of companies and they're super reluctant. And also we've talked about this other idea as well of, people are really open to getting critique about their product or about, a model they're developing or piece of software they're developing, as long as it doesn't like directly contradict the profit motive. And there's moments I notice in algorithmic auditing where, some of the challenges brought forth in terms of this algorithm is unethical or ineffective in this particular way sort of interferes with the product timeline, and companies become hostile as a result of that. And part of it too is that sometimes someone will build an algorithm to be applied on an affected population that isn't the user. And this is something I feel like I'm repeating myself a lot, but they'll build the facial recognition tool for the police, for police use, and it'll affect a different community, and the advocacy group might be representing that community, but the company doesn't actually care because they're optimizing for what's best for the police officer. So that dynamic, I think, is less common in sort of like traditional security software dynamics. And that makes it very challenging.
And I think that's something that we sort of like quickly understood, right? Like um, to the extent that people think they can solve everything with magic machine learning, right? Like, oh, you have a difficult society problem, magic machine learning will solve that. Magic bug bounties isn't the way to solve magic machine learning problems.
Yeah, exactly.
One of our interviewees has this really fun way to put it. Katie Masuris, who's a sort of like extraordinarily smart and in this area and has been very great and help us think through that. She talks about the digestive systems that go beyond the bounties, right? So you have a bug bounty program, great, but then are you as an institution able to actually digest what's going to come out of it? Do you have sound, processes in place that can take that into account at the level of the full life cycle of the product? Do you have a mature way to think about this issue that enables you to actually ingest what the bug bounty may produce? And I think, unfortunately, when we look at the algorithmic harm space, a lot of the answer to that question is not yet. And I wonder if we're going to need to help build the digestive tracks before we can put bounties on it. And
I think this goes back to your point around, is it actually okay that right now we have this, Twitter justice sort of informal mechanism in place? And I think it's okay to a certain extent, but the things that will be promoted on Twitter are topics that are of concern to a very specific population, and it might not even represent the situations that cause the most harm. So even an idea of how to prioritize and verify, like those ideas that really provide that structure of like, how do we go from someone being upset about something to actual accountability, like that requires structure, that requires like infrastructure that doesn't currently exist in order to make that pipeline clear. And like that the digestive, like we need intestines to digest, use your analogy. Like we actually need like, a structure in order for that to happen. So I think that like, that's definitely something that's truly lacking in the algorithmic space, is that lack of structure leads to situations where someone might raise an alarm and just due to lack of press interest, for example, nothing happens. Or they might raise the alarm and it's this huge story, but because there's no actual sort of like formal mechanisms of accountability, the company can just ignore the story or spin the story and like let it go. So yeah, connecting, going from, we know that this harm is there, and it's a valid harm and it's a prioritized harm. Going from that to like actually, compensating a victim or pulling something off of the market, recalling a faulty product. It's like a very mysterious process right now. And I feel like more structure would actually lead to like a more reliable outcome of like accountability, like you're mentioning. Yeah.
And I'm excited that we're looking into sort of the history of the bug bounty space too, because, it looks like there's, a few of the things that we learned as we started looking into the bug bounty is like, there is no such thing as a bug bounty model, right? There's actually a lot of different ways to do this, different ways to host a bug bounty program. The platforms themselves are very different. And so I think that this exposed us to like a little bit of the choose your own adventure design rabbit hole of how you can pull that. But we were surprised, honestly, that there were not more adversarial models that had succeeded, right? Like by and large, it really is a space that, as you said, requires the institution to be bought in, requires them to have the mature digestive tracts for it. And I think it's fair to say that we're not there yet. And some of the companies, honestly, reactions in the face of these issues are concerning and doesn't suggest that they're a minute away from getting good digestive tracts on.
I was going to say, I think that also says something about the nature of security problems, right? Like security problems, there's an alignment in terms of incentive there where a company wants you to find its vulnerabilities so that it can patch them. We don't know this for sure, but there's, it's very rare that, patching a vulnerability wouldn't be like an economically beneficial move for the company to make so that, future hackers can access that information. Whereas sometimes with algorithmic auditing or algorithmic accountability, addressing the issue requires an overhaul of your data practice, or it requires, consultation with an affected community member, or, the ask some, or it might require getting rid of the product completely to protect certain people. So the ask sometimes is something that people resist, even if it's a documentation ask of like, can you please write this down? I've had like my early experiences in this field was just me, thinking that it wasn't that big a deal to just do this thing, and then realizing the amount of resistance coming from certain companies asked to do that thing. So I think the type of interventions that people are asking of companies in the security space really changes in the algorithmic sort of auditing space, where the dynamic shifts, and there's so many other reasons. Like there's so many reasons in my mind why they're hostile. It's like a rational reaction from the company, which kind of like pushes these algorithmic auditors into this more like adversarial dynamic and position. So I feel like, yeah, that is like a huge difference there. Yeah.
And to your point, I think like one of the key makers of that difference is there is a mature regulatory framework. I mean, mature-ish, right? Like there is a sense of like there is a sense of regulation in that space.
Yeah.
It's interesting because, in the work that we've done, we also see cybersecurity struggle with expanding its boundaries to better include socio-technical harms, right? And I think there's definitely a moment of reckoning around more privacy-oriented cybersecurity harms. And so, for instance, in our work, we also saw some of the bug bounties adapt to that, right? Like we're going to create a new type of submission that's focused on, for instance, API abuse, which is a little bit of a shift in perspective, but there's definitely sort of a struggle to expand that boundaries. Some say that expansion of boundary is needed because some of these socio-technical issues are cybersecurity harms, and some say no, they're too different from that space. The tools and methods are too different. It's actually not helpful to stretch the boundaries. So that's definitely something we see.
Yeah. And again, like, thinking about, who in the space is making these, is prioritizing these directions, I think is really important, where, like in the algorithmic auditing space, there's like an engineering incentive to care about, or to advocate for like, oh, if I can just like debias my model, and that's the intervention required.
Magic debiasing.
Find this a magical, the famed unbiased or debiased data set that we have yet to find, after years of searching.
A nice certification, like it's certified debiased.
Certified debiased. But it's kind of like, I think people are like engineers, I find, and I'll include myself in this, especially when I was first sort of in this space, like you're eager to seek problems that have easy solutions. And it's much more uncomfortable to realize the fact that, this is not just a technical problem. And I really love that security was going through this phase too, of recognizing that this is not just a technical problem and there's other dynamics at play. Because the reality of it is a lot of technology, and especially how technology sort of intersects with like harms and harms discovery, like tech hurts people because of factors outside of just the properties of the technology itself. Sometimes the technology fails, and that causes a lot of the hurt that people experience. But there's so many other factors involved in that result outside of just the design of the technology or the properties of the technology. And I find that, this is something that both communities are going through right now. I find it really cool that cybersecurity is going through it, because there was a long phase of just, we're looking for technical glitches and we're trying to find technical patches. So the fact that, that community has expanded its definition is like, okay, like algorithmic auditing definitely in a situation where, I think the interesting thing about machine learning is like it involves data, and data is just such a, it requires this inherent sort of like socio-technical consideration, just because it's generated from humans and it's embodying and such a specific type of like, culture and very specific sort of like ambiguities. So I feel like the fact that data is a reality of a lot of algorithmic systems, makes that socio-technical consideration even more like necessary. So yeah, I'm hoping like the algorithmic auditing space also sort of expands even its view beyond bias and really starts asking some of these questions that we're seeing happen in the cybersecurity space, where it's just like, this is not just like a question of me asking you to do this technical patch. Like, I actually need you to change your engineering process, change your documentation stuff. Like that's, I don't know. We'll see if they do it, but like, I do think that's the hope, right?
A conversation that's happening, and it's interesting because it's absolutely happening on privacy. It's also happening on, for instance, when I think about information operations, it's definitely like at the super fascinating boundary of this space, right? Some of this is a cybersecurity issue, some of this is not. And so they struggle with its own boundary. And being forced to reflect upon like, okay, how do we define the problem that we're tackling, and what part of our tool set applies there versus like what needs a total reinvention is great. And I think one of the most important like pieces that we should also like highlight is how you've, you know, helped reframe this, and like, no, we're not looking at bugs or biases or whatnot. We're looking at harms, right? Like the framing is a harm, and this will help you open your eyes, really.
No, and I went through this whole phase. I don't even know if I've told you this story yet, but I went through this whole phase of like when I first worked on my first paper, even I really thought of bias as a bug. Like I thought of like, oh, this is like a technical glitch. Like this is a situation where, and I do think like there are a lot of bugs in modern algorithmic tools. Like, you know, there are a lot of ways in which we construct these systems and they fail because they're not well constructed. And, you know, there's problems in how it's constructed. And I'm like very honest about the reality of that. But I do think that, you know, sometimes it really is like, to address bias requires like a redefinition of like what it means for the system to work. Or it's a definition, or it's like a, you know, byproduct of a situation where people were not reflecting on like the history of, you know, a particular context, or how it's going to be used, or how it can be weaponized. And like those kind of considerations of like how like injustice can result from an algorithm that has, you know, that's a separate conversation from like the quality of the construction of the algorithm. Like that really, that was a really big sort of like shift in my mindset, where I was like, oh, like there's a lot, like modern day algorithms are very buggy systems. I will be the first person to know like there's a lot of things that are poorly constructed about them. But they also, you know, there's also a lot about, you know, how they're used and how they're built. That's almost like the separate question, like you mentioned, this more socio-technical question. So yeah, I definitely think that that's something that the machine learning community kind of has gone through this like phase of like discovering this and realizing this. And I'll put myself in there because I definitely went through that phase of like realizing that, you know, there is a sense of debugging required, but it's not just that. There's a lot more to like communicate with a harms discovery report, or there's a lot more to communicate or to address when you're trying to mitigate harms. So yeah, and I'm, you know, from what I've read of like the shift in terms of cybersecurity, you know, part of that like socio-technical, like it's part of an openness to the socio-technical approach comes from the realization that, you know, you have harms coming from all kinds of sources, not just the faulty tech source.
I will say it's a slow process, right? I don't want to
oh yeah, like, for sure. I don't think it's that fast on this side either.
I think something that I appreciate in the work that we're doing together with HL is also sort of the interdisciplinary lens. And, you know, Sasha, who's also part of this project, like in their book, Design Justice, I think also puts on the table a lot of things that should be integrated in the way we do adversarial security research, right? Because when we think about, oh, how is a system going to be abused? How will it create harm? There is also some form of like secret design thinking that goes into how we test for these adversarial hypotheses that I think often is self-centered, ignores community harms,
Yeah.
and leads to bad security. So I'm also excited to bring Sasha's design justice ideas into rethinking how really we do adversarial testing, because I
Yeah.
think that too tends to often be very misguided.
Yeah, and that's like another thing I love about sort of our AJL collaboration as well, is that interdisciplinary element, but also this very sort of community oriented, community focused element. I've sort of been in spaces where corporate actors are the loudest voices in the room and really define a lot of things about the process that we end up going along with. And the harms are sort of described in this like defensive way. Like they'll talk about like the 3 lines of defense and protecting the company from liability and quality control of their product so that it gets widely adopted. And those are like legitimate priorities for a company or for a company representative to have. But when you start thinking about harms from the perspective of those that are impacted, from the perspective of community members, and you start really trying to figure out like what are the tools that community members can use to better understand the harms that impact their lives and work to report those harms, the conversation and the question kind of just like shifts completely. And a whole set of strategies that would feel incompatible with this like 3 lines of defense model that's really popular in the corporate world. There's a lot more options, or there's a lot more interesting sort of like directions to play to consider. So another, like for example, like looking at things from a community lens, me and Sasha are realizing there's much more of an imperative with respect to disclosure and education, whereas like companies, when they're thinking about identifying harms for their purposes, they don't want to be in a position where they're opening access of their model for other people, or they're disclosing details about what tools they're using, or how the specific engineering details of how something is constructed. And they're not also investing in educating users to the to a degree beyond of what would be like profitable for them.
Yeah.
Whereas if you look at harms discovery, or even this conversation of algorithmic harm from like a community lens, or like really anchoring or prioritizing that community lens, then it's like education is like super important. It's incredibly important to make sure that the public understands what potential harms could exist, or what potential applications could affect them. So yeah, it was this whole interesting experience too, and that's something that her book is really great about, sort of outlining this need to really anchor and prioritize the affected population's perspective. Yeah.
Something that's also quite fascinating to see is how some of the cybersecurity practices are getting imported and sort of like reapplied. And perhaps they work, but for other reasons. So like, I was really interested when you shared that in releasing Gender Shades, the paper, you also thought about the, sort of responsible disclosure model, which I think here applies, but for other different reasons that it does in InfoSec. So if you want to share that story, I think it's a great one.
For sure. Yeah, and that was something we outlined in our actionable auditing paper, where there's sort of like coordinated vulnerability disclosure, which is sort of the procedure in cybersecurity to make sure that when you release information about software vulnerability, you're doing so responsibly. So you inform the company, and then you give the company a deadline to respond, and then you include the company's response and the communications with the public. There were so many interesting reflections on like, how do we actually release this information to the company and to the public in a way that ensures safety and also protects the public. And we literally adapted this process and called it the coordinated bias disclosure process, where we really were like, this is great, this is exactly what we were looking for. One of the challenges with a lot of past algorithmic audits, where researchers were really worried to name companies that they were auditing, a lot of the HCI audit papers that were sort of released before gender shades were reluctant to name companies because they were worried of a hostile corporate reaction. So gender
They were
shades,
right to be worried.
yeah, figures they were right. They were, as we know, they were fully right to be worried.
Yeah.
But it was just, I was just really interesting because with gender shades, that was something that Joy had really thought about, and with the coordinated bias disclosure, we were able to really kind of do our due diligence where the companies knew it was coming and we could include their response. And it was just a much more organized process around doing it. And I think that's most of what we hope to poach from cybersecurity is like there's a maturity to the field of cybersecurity where there's more structure and it's just a little bit more organized around some of these processes that kind of happen haphazardly in the algorithmic auditing space right now.
We've been wondering a lot about the coordinated vulnerability disclosure process because I think in cybersecurity, one of the main reasons it makes sense is you're gonna disclose a bug that others can use, and so you need to protect the users.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily the case in algorithmic harms discovery.
Oh yeah,
I have to say, sometimes I wonder if importing those practices from cybersecurity doesn't give too much leeway, frankly, to the corporation and industries that are being studied, right? Because there are different imperatives, and some of these so some of the differences that we talked about between like algorithmic harms and cybersecurity bug, including the fact that a cybersecurity bug can be exploited by others and can be sold on a market for cybersecurity bugs, don't really apply to that space. And so it's been really interesting to keep these differences in mind and to be thoughtful about like what do we import and what do we import with what we're importing.
And I think I think that's incredibly true in the sense of like the rationale behind why it makes sense in cybersecurity differs from the rationale of what elements are taken into the bias disclosure sort of process. I think there's an interesting interesting points of alignment in the sense of part of why cybersecurity also doesn't want to release it or first to the public is to give the companies a chance to respond so that the companies don't, sue them or accuse them of being hackers or legally pursue them, for releasing that vulnerability publicly without communicating it to them first. So the stakes are quite different as well in the sense of like those are quite high stakes. I think there's moments where that difference becomes like incredibly clear, and it becomes very tricky to figure out what you take and what you leave. Another thing too is like a lot of and we don't talk a lot about this, but CFAA and other sort of legal structures put in place anti-hacking laws interfere with algorithmic auditing in the sense that it makes it difficult to scrape the data that you need in order to analyze a system to conduct a particular audit. And that's like a tension that is becoming increasingly clear, where sometimes there's alignment in the sense of what makes it easier to sort of like hack and figure out security vulnerabilities also is required for an algorithmic audit to even happen. So there's just so many moments of intersection where it's just like, oh, these are very different problems, but clearly points of alignment and specific causes that I think both communities would probably advocate for.
They're different and yet they're similar in such striking ways, because I think that adopting this language to companies who are familiar with these processes is also a way to say, hey, we expect you to be responsible in the face of that disclosure, right? Like we've given you a heads up. We expect you to like actually own up to it, fix it, and enter this dialogue in good faith. And I think your point about like how do we create the safe harbors for researchers who do that is a really important one. Like what models do we have to create these safe harbors for researchers? Can we find them in the cybersecurity space? Perhaps. Can we find them elsewhere? Perhaps. But I think that the things we're looking for are the same, right? Like let's safe harbor the researchers, and let's create the expectations that industry needs to behave in the face of these disclosure and to be cooperative and transparent and accountable in the face of these disclosures.
Yeah, and we've talked about this, but another unfortunate similarity between cybersecurity and sort of the early fairness algorithmic auditing space is that like lack of diversity and
Yeah.
representation. Like it makes it very difficult for members of the affected or vulnerable populations to really be able to participate actively. And I
Yeah.
think that's like one of the things that we're trying to, in the case of algorithmic auditing, because of the data element of things, the connection to that affected population is even more direct, in the sense of those that are affected by the system often, have artifacts or representations of themselves embedded in that system in a way that, increases the stakes of how they respond or how they react to the situation. So yeah, that's making it very interesting in the sense of how do you actually create a space that is, able to sort of accommodate or even like allow for the participation of that affected population, so that when you're looking at the problem, you actually have this incredibly community informed view or community informed lens. And I think that's something that will be very, very tricky to figure out in both communities.
Yeah.
And there will be some resistance, there'll be some cultural resistance to that shift as well.
And that's something on which the cybersecurity field, InfoSec field in general, has been bad at, right? Like excluding entire categories of users from their conception of harm. That explains like why stalkerware, for instance, is something that the community took so long to look at, right? I think that this recognition that the way in which the community has defined harms, or even user, right, this term that we should be talking much more about, is also creating blind spots that makes the community less effective at its stated purpose, which is to protect individuals from digital harms.
Yeah. And we see that exactly with algorithmic auditing as well. When you don't have the participation of a wide range of people, it's very easy to neglect certain issues. Something that was recently reported on was sort of the neglect of, ICE's risk assessment tool, and how, immigration, especially immigration with respect to, the deportation of undocumented individuals, is something that the typical machine learning researcher might not necessarily connect with as a topic. And as a result of that, it becomes difficult to incentivize, the group that is meant to already represent the space to care about some of these problems that feel unfamiliar or uncomfortable for them. And this is just even more of an incentive to increase the range of perspectives that we include in terms of defining and prioritizing what important problems are.
So I know we need to wrap. I love having these conversations together, so I could go on for a long time. I think we owe it to everybody to leave it on a note of optimism, which is I am very excited by the practices that we're interrogating in trying to figure out what does it mean to build a reliable participatory harms discovery system, and what else do we need around it for it to work? What else do we need in terms of regulation? What else do we need in terms of digestive system in the private sector? What are the set of practices that really we want to see around us for this to work? So I'm super grateful to be working with you on this and to have had this conversation. And I will leave the final word to you, Deb.
Yeah, I was like, I don't know what that last word is.
Final 5 minutes.
Final comments. I think this was a great moment of like reflecting on what we've learned in the project so far. I think the conclusion, or my understanding of the situation, is that there's so much to learn from other groups that have gone through this process before. This idea of identifying harms in technical systems, and specifically like information security, that a whole journey that the field has gone through is something that we can learn from. Just because the form of the technical artifact has kind of evolved from software programs to machine learning models, doesn't mean that there's not a lot of sort of parallel problems that exist, but also parallel processes that we can learn from. Even if the problems are not quite the exact same, there's still a lot to take in. And I've personally benefited so much from even hearing your stories of like how passionate people are about bug bounties and everything. I'm hoping there will be a day where people will have that passion for algorithmic bias bounties or whatever happens, where people can really think incredibly intentionally about how we think of how we characterize harms, how we identify harms, and how we address them. That's my hope, at least, that we move beyond the Twitter outrage phase and we actually have a more structured response to all of this.
Definitely more than a copy paste of the bug bounty structure. What we're doing is a reimagining what the bounty principles could look like and would suggest in the space of algorithmic harms, and that's quite an exciting.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I think even that process of like the redesign or the rebrand, not even the rebrand, but just really like I mentioned earlier, sort of the borrowing of the things that work and that are applicable, and then letting go of the things that are not as compatible.
Right.
Yeah, I think that whole process is just and ultimately, like, it's such an engaging design challenge. So I'm excited to sort of see what comes as a result of sort of this very long and interesting like design process we're going through right now. It's been really fun, and I think at minimum we'll like learn a lot about this very related community, and hopefully pick up some lessons and make sure that we don't make the same mistakes and we learn from the successes. Yeah.
That's a good goal. I can live with that.
I'm good. Yeah.
Good.
It's like, I don't know if that was not optimistic enough, but we'll find out.
I think that works.